Hi there, I'm Laura Malerba, and in this video I will be discussing the ways in which developed countries have tackled corruption. I will specifically talk about the successes of anti-corruption policies implemented in Finland and Singapore, as well as what developing countries could learn from these case studies. In order to better understand anti-corruption policies and how they work, we need to first understand what corruption and anti-corruption actually are as concepts. And since this video focuses on tackling corruption in developed countries, we will also look into what constitutes a developed country and how it is different from a developing country. Once we've clarified these key terms, only then can we look into more specific case studies. First, we will look into the country with one of the lowest scores of corruption, Finland, and after, we'll move on to a very different part of the world, specifically Singapore. Looking into these two highly developed countries and how they have each tackled corruption is particularly interesting when considering their very different backgrounds, as Finland is the epitome of a democratic nation, whereas Singapore is a one-party state, but we'll get more into that later. Finally, we will discuss what developing countries can learn from these two examples, followed by a conclusion of everything we talked about. So what is corruption and what can be done against it? Corruption is difficult to define and measure because they can take on many different forms. So most legislation often defines types of corruption, such as bribery, rather than giving a proper definition. However, Transparency International, an anti-corruption NGO, was able to capture the essence of corruption by describing it as the use of entrusted power for private gain. Corruption can be separated into two main types, petty and grand. Petty corruption is small-scale and relatively inconsequential. However, grand corruption, such as electoral fraud, can have much more serious implications by significantly reducing the development and standard of a certain country. Having said that, there are a number of highly corrupt countries which have developed rapidly, such as the US and China. In general, though, corruption stalls the progress of a country economically, socially, and politically, so cracking down on corruption is incredibly important for national and global development. As mentioned previously, we will be looking specifically into how Finland and Singapore have pioneered in anti-corruption policies. Both of these countries are highly developed, and according to Britannica, this means that they have a good standard of living, high-quality education and healthcare, as well as a number of employment opportunities in secondary, tertiary, and quaternary industries. Now that we've understood what corruption and a developed nation is, we can look into the specific case studies on tackling corruption, starting with Finland. According to the most recent figures by Transparency International, Finland is ranked second on the Corruption Perceptions Index. Within the past 10 years, Finland has been among the top 6 countries included in the CPI, together with Denmark, Sweden, New Zealand, Switzerland, and Singapore. So what is their secret? How does Finland continuously manage to win against corruption? It all boils down to having good laws, good citizens, and lots of transparency. But what exactly does this mean, and how does this translate into the real world? Well, let's start with good laws. Finland has a list of essential laws and acts with the sole purpose of preventing corruption and improving integrity amongst public and private institutions. These laws are built into Finland's constitution, its penal code, governmental regulations, as well as its civil service, so that every key component of Finland's bureaucracy has specific laws to catch any form of corruption. The second important anti-corruption measure requires good citizens. This can be ensured by using the laws stated above, which promote good behavior in public organizations by seriously penalizing things like giving and accepting any form of bribery. However, good citizens go beyond just regulation. Firstly, citizens need to value things like loyalty and transparency, which allow for much cleaner administration practices. These kinds of values play a major role in Finnish society, and not adhering to them can lead to public shame and major scrutiny by the media. On top of this, meritocracy and equity are essential components in forming good citizens and curbing corruption. Finland is a particularly egalitarian country, where working hard pays off, irrespective of someone's personal background. This significantly reduces the temptation to partake in corrupt practices, as citizens know that the cleaner route to success is a viable and effective option, as well as it being highly encouraged by society. Finally, a country cannot successfully curb corruption without accountability. In Finland, accountability is ensured mainly through the implementation of watchdog institutions, which audit branches of the government and public organizations. For example, the Parliamentary Audit Committee oversees the management of government finances and compliance with the budget. These types of committees play an essential role in sniffing out any dirty work before it gets out of hand, thus effectively preventing corruption from spreading. We have just analyzed the types of strategies that a democratic country can implement in order to curb corruption. But what if we were to look at how a different form of government would approach the same issue? In order to answer this question, we will look into how Singapore, a one-party state and the least corrupt country in Asia, successfully managed to tackle corruption in an extremely short amount of time. This feat is often seen as a miracle, especially when considering Singapore's long and complicated colonial history, which normalized corruption in all sectors of Singaporean society. There are 5 key components that allowed for Singapore's swift eradication of corruption. These are political will, meritocracy, the CPIB, administrative reforms, and zero-tolerance laws. Political will refers to the determination and commitment of political leaders to curb corruption. In Singapore, the main party in power, People's Action Party, or PAP, made it a number 1 priority on their agenda to zero in on corruption and eradicate it for good. This allowed for serious investigations to take place to understand and analyze the causes of corruption in order to then provide adequate responses. As with Finland, Singapore deeply values meritocracy. As a result, Singapore was able to institutionalize their meritocratic values, meaning public officials could solely be judged based on merit and not their personal backgrounds. This automatically filtered out forms of corruption like nepotism or favoritism. The third component of Singapore's anti-corruption strategy includes the Corruption Practices Investigation Bureau, or CPIB. The CPIB was set up in 1952 by the British colonial government in order to tackle the high corruption rates that were present at the time. After its establishment, and once the PAP came into government, funding to the CPIB was significantly increased. The CPIB thus became an essential part of Singapore's anti-corruption strategy in investigating corrupt practices in both the private and public sphere, and effectively contributed to Singapore's success in tackling corruption. Finally, Singapore reinforced all of its anti-corruption measures through strict, binding laws and regulations that justly punished any kind of corrupt activities, as well as reorganizing its bureaucratic systems to improve public service efficiency and effectiveness. All of these measures combined explain how Singapore was able to transition so swiftly from a highly corrupt and problematic state to its current position as the least corrupt country in Asia. Although this shift is often called a miracle, behind this transformation lies a hefty, multi-pronged approach to tackling the corruption issues that Singapore had faced, as well as a serious commitment to the role. So, what can developing countries learn from this? Firstly, if developing countries want to eradicate corruption, the first step that needs to take place is political commitment, as seen with Singapore. Without a committed and dedicated government, there is little that a country can do about its corruption issues. So unfortunately, cycles of corruption can only be broken if the right people are in charge at the right time with a promise to ending corruption. This task becomes even more difficult if the developing country in question is in a state of conflict, a factor that greatly inhibits the chances of successfully tackling corruption. However, assuming that a developing country isn't facing any kind of conflict and that its government is committed to eradicating corruption, they need to understand that they should do so from various different approaches. Both Finland and Singapore have well-established legislation that penalizes corrupt activity and keeps public officials under strict supervision. However, implementing legislature alone can lead to bureaucratic loopholes that only exacerbate corruption. Thus, other approaches are necessary on top of legislation to combat corruption. We can see examples of this in how Finland and Singapore both have well-established watchdog institutions, and they have normalized meritocratic values in their society, 2 highly effective ways to tackle corruption that don't directly rely on legislature. In conclusion, this video discussed the successes of anti-corruption policies in Finland and Singapore. We discussed some key terms when talking about anti-corruption, and went over a number of strategies implemented by Finland and Singapore that successfully curbed corruption. Finally, we discussed what developing countries can learn from these case studies, noting in particular that countries in states of conflict have a significantly harder time dealing with corruption. Having said that, as long as governments of developing countries are committed to the goal and consider the various strategies needed to tackle corruption, it is likely that we will continue to see countries clean up their reputations and transition to less corrupt societies.